everyone and welcome to another video with me, 320 Simpilot, and today we're going to look at auto-landing the A320 NEO in Microsoft Flight Simulator. I've had this requested a lot on some of my other Microsoft Flight Simulator videos, so today I thought it would be fun to give it a go and see how the aircraft behaves. As always, I am a real-world Airbus pilot, but none of this is for any real-world use. It's just to explore Flight Simulator a little bit and hopefully give you some extra context on what we do with the real aircraft. For today, we're going to be starting off in Salzburg, and we are going to fly the ILS onto runway 15 and do an auto-land and see how the aeroplane behaves. Auto-lands are used mostly in aviation when there is an issue with visibility, so when the pilots don't have enough time to see the runway, so it's better that the automatics land the aircraft instead. They are not used all the time. Typically they're used very rarely, and we train for them in simulators to make sure we know what we are doing. A lot of work in an auto-land situation revolves around being prepared for what the systems should be doing and what to do if they go wrong. So it takes a lot of concentration and monitoring. It is not as easy as just letting the aircraft do it for us, but it is in the Airbus a very simple process to set up and a very involved process to monitor. As you can see, the weather here today in Salzburg is very nice, so it is not normal to do an auto-land when the conditions allow for normal visibility, unless you are just checking that the airplane is still capable of doing it. So sometimes we will do it to ensure the airplane behaves properly, or to test out the equipment at the airport. But if you're going to do that, you'll do it in good conditions so that you can monitor visually and take over if you need to, or if you see it doing something you don't like. To fly an automatic approach and landing, we will also have several bits of equipment that we need to be working. So the aircraft has a way of telling us, and it's not working sadly in Microsoft Flight Simulator, but it will tell us if there's systems that are not working properly or whether we are downgraded. And there's other things we are required to have, such as window shield heating, things like that, that may not be monitored by the aircraft, and we need to check they're all working. So if you are going to go and do an auto-land, it does take a bit of extra thought about what state your aircraft is in and what equipment is at the airport you're flying to. Not all airports will allow you to auto-land. Some of them, due to geographical conditions or equipment at the airports, don't have the facilities to allow aircraft to auto-land, or they're not tuned carefully enough for whatever reason. So it is not a thing that you can just do everywhere, anytime. It does take thought and preparation. As you can see, I am pretty much set up for the approach. Let's select medium auto brake. Looking in the FMGC, we've done our approach page, and this time I put in a decision height of 50 feet, which I know is the minima for doing a Cat 3A approach. This will be into Salzburg. Cat 3A is a step down from the full-on Cat 3B, and to do a Cat 3A approach we only need one autopilot, and we would expect it to say Cat 3 single whilst we're on the approach. That's what the real aircraft would do. I'm not sure if this will work in Microsoft Flight Simulator. If our aircraft is only Cat 3 single capable, then typically that means only one autopilot or some other failure. Then that means we can only fly a Cat 3A approach, which does have a requirement to be visual with something on the ground. So we've got a height of 50 feet where we need to be able to see something, and a minimum RVR requirement as well. RVR is the visual range, so it's not the visibility at the airport, it's the visual range along the runway, and it's measured using specialist equipment. The reason is the RVRs will typically be a bit more. Your visibility will be slightly better than you get just in pure visibility. Your visibility down the runway will be slightly better because the runway is lit up, so you'll be able to see the lights slightly further than just normal visibility allows. If you have both autopilots working and you can do Cat 3 dual, then it's possible to land with no decision height, where you don't need to be able to see anything. And that is quite impressive, and that usually has an RVR, so a visual range requirement of just 75 meters, which is really not a lot at all. Before flying one of these approaches, the airport will have to set up the equipment properly on the ground. They will make sure there's no big metal machinery in the way of the transmitters that we use that transmit the ILS information to the aircraft. And there's all sorts of protected zones and special things on standby. So it's quite an involved process if an airport goes into low visibility procedures, which is something that would have to be in place if you were going to fly one of these approaches using the low visibility minima as if you were actually in cloud. But today, because the visibility is so good, we can actually use this just to practice. And I will be monitoring carefully to see what the aircraft does. Obviously, there are lots of differences now with the Airbus A320 NEO in Microsoft Flight Simulator and the real thing, so this will not be very representative of what the actual aircraft would do. I'm imagining anyway. But as you can see, we are getting set up for our ILS, so let's get prepared. So I'm going to descend down to 4,000 feet. The approach phase is activated, and I'm going to put out flap 1. Speed is all in the right place. Flaps to 1. The difference between Cat 3 dual and Cat 3 single is the difference between being what's called fail active and fail passive. If you are only Cat 3 single, you are fail passive, which means a major failure will mean that the aircraft loses its ability to fly the approach and auto land. Cat 3 dual means you are fail active, which means there are some failures of the automatics that will still allow the aircraft to continue with the auto land. So obviously being Cat 3 dual is better. To do Cat 3 dual approaches, we do require both autopilots, which sadly you are not able to use in Microsoft Flight Simulator. In the real aircraft, once you have armed the approach button, which I will do now, you can select both autopilots, but that does not work in Microsoft Flight Simulator. Also, we see we have this glitch where the localizer and glide slope don't display on the PFD, so I will have to select LS on the rows, EFIS control, and then I can see it here. So I have armed the localizer and I've armed the glide slope. So hopefully this will turn on. It should show us the modes here. So what are we expecting to see now? Well, we're expecting it to do its usual, and it should say speed, glide slope, localizer, and then our category of landing, so Cat 3 single, because we only are using one autopilot. But I know that Microsoft Flight Simulator won't do that. As we then descend down the ILS, there's a few more FMA changes we need to see. By 350 feet radio altimeter, which will be the number down here, I need to see it say land across here. And these FMAs, as always, are very important, the flight mode enunciators, which I do talk about in my other videos, including my autopilot basics video. So by 350 feet above the ground, which is what the radio altimeter tells us, we will need it to say land. Then we will monitor that very carefully, because by 30 feet radio, it needs to change into flare mode. If it doesn't, we're going around, and if it doesn't change to land mode, we're going around. There is also an auto land light that would flash red if there is any major problem, but that only applies when you're doing Cat 3 dual, or typically applies when you're doing Cat 3 dual, although I'm sure it can light up in lots of situations. So I suspect that's not working in this aircraft. So by 30 feet, it should change into flare, which would mean it will flare by raising the nose slightly and get ready for landing. By 10 feet rad out, I would expect the airplane to say the words retard, retard, which is an instruction for me to move the thrust levers from the climb gate to idle. Because we're doing an automatic landing, the real aircraft will actually do that on its own. It won't move the thrust levers though, which is why it tells us to do it, but it will command thrust idle for the landing. Let's put out flap 2 now. That's the 2. And we see the glide slope coming, so we should descend fairly soon. So the retard call out normally is a reminder to remind us to close the thrust levers by the time we touch down. But in an auto land, it is an instruction because the aeroplane will have already commanded thrust idle. Then, when the main wheels touch down, I expect rollouts to appear here, where the automatics will then continue rolling along the runway. And the automatics are capable of doing that. There are crosswind limits, typically about 30 knots headwind, 20 knots across wind, and 10 knot tailwind for doing an approach like this. So it is capable of rolling out in some sort of wind. The rollout means it will maintain the runway centerline and continue along. Now if you try and vacate the runway by using the tiller or your pedals in the real aircraft, but you forget to disengage the autopilot, when you let go of the tiller, it will turn itself back onto the localizer because it will quite aggressively want to maintain the localizer, which we can't see on the PFD, but we can see here. Okay, so now we're following the glide slope and the localizer, sadly without the correct FMAs, but we know that's the situation in this aircraft at the moment. Also, I notice it does not say Cat 3 single or Cat 3 dual or Cat 1 or Cat 2, so it would normally display that here above the DH or NDA. It would tell you which mode it's in. It is possible to auto land in a few of these, but here we go. Right, let's configure for the landing and let's see if we get those other mode changes. So, gear down. Once the gear is down, arm the ground spoilers, which they are. I don't know why it complains that ground spoilers aren't. I'm not even sure that is a caution. We've got the landing lights on. The seatbelt should be on. If you're wondering why I have those capabilities, it's because this is the modified Airbus, which I have in my other video. Okay, time to put up the rest of the flap then. Let's go flaps 3. Speed is checked, flaps to full. And now it's doing a good job actually on the localizer and glide slope this time. So let's see what happens. Got a nice view of the runway, 2 whites, 2 reds. Salzburg is a very spectacular airport to fly to. You have this big ridge here, which has quite a complicated go-around procedure as a result. Bit of wing rocking there, but that's fine. So we would be monitoring very carefully to check that none of these localizer or glide slope deviations were too much, or if they were, we might get this auto land light flashing red at us, and it would then mean that we would definitely be going around. If it doesn't engage any of these modes, then I will go around. As you can see, Salzburg is actually not at sea level, it's higher than that, about 1400 feet. So at 500 feet above the ground, we're still about 1800 feet above the sea level. So by 350, I want it to say land. I will carry on this one. There we go, land. So it has correctly changed to land, and now a speed mode is still in, so that's good. So the next one, by 30 feet rad out, it should say flare, but it seems to be getting us high on the glide slope. I'm going to continue with this just to see what the Microsoft Flight Simulator Airbus can do, because it is trying to follow a glide slope, but normally we would obviously be going around from this point, as this is far too high for this approach.
60, 50, 40.
Flare mode has engaged, that's good. I'm going to idle the thrust levers. Wow, that did not work. Okay, so here we are on final approach again, after the first one was not successful. It seems to be struggling to get itself onto the localizer this time, and it's still a little bit high on the glide slope. It has changed into land mode, which is good, so let's see what happens. Obviously in real life by this point we would be going around, and certainly if you were visual you would definitely take over and land as well. After having several failed approaches into Salzburg where the aircraft could not manage, I have changed destination, so we are now in Manchester, and we are trying to fly the ILS 05 left with no decision height, because this is a Cat 3 dual capable runway. Now again, in real life you wouldn't be able to do this without both autopilots working or Cat 3 dual displayed here. And also what's interesting in this aircraft is it automatically says no DH. Now, actually, for it to say no DH, you have to type in the words no into the DH box, which it doesn't let me do. So if you leave it blank, it seems to come up with no. So let's see if it has better luck here on this approach. As I said, this is not what you would do. You would need to have some sort of minima if you were using only one autopilot in the real aircraft. But as you can see, even with the approach mode armed, it won't let me. Something I'm beginning to notice in this aircraft is, to get the ILS to appear on the PFD, I usually have to change the approach type that's loaded into the FMGC from the one that I loaded the flight with. So I've been loading the flight using Microsoft Flight Simulator's flight planning as part of the flight setup, which I think is a great system, but sadly every time I do that, it does not display the ILS. So I've changed the runway to a different one and then back again, and now it seems to appear. And we even get glide slope mode, sadly no localizer mode. Okay, let's put out let's start to configure. So that's going to be gear down. Soon the radio altimeter will come to life, so we will wait for that. And once again we have nice visual conditions so we can monitor this and see if it works. If it does, we can try it in low visibility conditions. Okay, speed is still good, so flaps can go to 3. Speed brakes are armed for the landing. Lights are on. And flaps to full. If you're wondering why some of these things are like this, like my doors page there, this is because this is a modified version, which I have a video on if you need help setting that up. Okay, we're now fully configured in a landing position with flaps at full, landing gear lever down. The aircraft can auto land even on one engine, the real aircraft, which is quite impressive. It's a very capable aircraft. It can also use just one autopilot. It can also auto land in, as I said, crosswinds, single engine conditions. It can, depending on the conditions, land flap 3 or flap full. So it's really amazing the autopilot works like that. So let's see what happens with this approach. As we can see, we are having trouble again where the aircraft will not maintain the localizer. And I don't know why it does this. Again, part of the issue is that it is in localizer mode. The heading bug isn't there. It's not in nav. But it just seems to lose its ability to track it at the last minute. And I've seen this happen to a few people.
300.
So in real life, of course, at this stage again, we would be going around
200.
or taking over and landing manually. As you can probably tell, we've been having a fair few difficulties getting this aircraft to auto land. I'm not entirely sure what the difference is between each approach that may allow it to land and which may not allow it to land, so we are now going to try Heathrow runway 9 left. Once again, I've set no decision height into the FMGC, so we shall see if it manages to intercept and land all on its own. Once again, we are back on final approach. So far so good. Glide slope mode engaged. We've got a good glide slope following. We've got the ILS displayed on the PFD, and we are still on the localizer for now. So that looks pretty good outside of the window as well. I quite like this glare effect. If you're landing straight into the sun, so this is a sunset flight, then you do get this effect where it can be quite hard to see the runway. So you have to balance your use of sunglasses and sun visors to try and help as well. So there's land mode, which is engaged before 350 readout, so that is good. Red altimeter is just past 350 there. I'm going to be listening for the auto thrust, or the aircraft to command the thrust levers to idle. But even if it doesn't, I will do it to give it a chance to actually land here. So we're waiting for flare mode by 30. There's flare mode, which is good. Wow, it didn't do much of a flare. Thrust levers to idle and letting it roll out. But sadly, although it says roll out, you can hear the triple click and the autopilot disconnect, which would actually keep going until you told it otherwise. So it has disconnected the autopilot. This is now a manual rollout. So although it did engage flare, the one time it actually managed to stay on the centre line, it really did not much of a flare, and we ended up with a very firm touchdown. That would, again, that would almost be a go-around. The theory in the real aircraft would be that if it did say flare, it was going to do something. So that would definitely, you'd have felt that landing. But we are still here. It did make it down, so let's have a go in some low visibility conditions. So I have done my best here to recreate a sort of foggy day. I'm not sure if I've managed to get the setting quite right. As you can see, we can still see down vertically, so if I look above the aircraft down, I've set a cloud layer to be set to the ground level, and I've set the particulates in the air to be high. So that is sometimes possible, even on low visibility days, because if you look at an angle, you can see that actually it is a foggy layer down there. So that's pretty representative. It can be all sorts of situations. Sometimes the fog is so dense you can't see down through it either. But here we go. So let's now try and do an auto land in these conditions. Okay, so here we are on final approach. Once again, it has engaged land mode, which is good. As you can see outside the window, we're not seeing very much at all, which is quite normal for an approach like this. In fact, I can just see the runway now, which is still earlier than you might in some of these sorts of landings. It could be that you don't see it until right down over the runway, or maybe not at all.
50, 40, 30, 20.
And then we would need to retard now. It touches down, bit of a wing drop, did a bit of a better flare that time, but still we are now manually rolling out on the runway. So as we've seen there, it is a variable thing in Microsoft Flight Simulator as to whether the aircraft will actually auto land properly or not. We can't quite set up the airplane as we would expect, but if you do want to try an auto land at the moment, all you can do is engage one autopilot and then look out for those FMA changes. You're looking for land by 350 feet, flare by 30 feet, and that's based on the radio altimeter. Before touchdown, you want to bring the thrust levers to idle as normal, usually around about 10 feet. But as we've seen, it can sometimes bank, it may not follow the ILS properly, and there's a few other things like that. Of course, these are all things that, you know, it's a default aircraft in the flight simulator. So I'm not criticizing, I'm just pointing out some of the things that may happen if you are trying to do this. And I've had to try several times in different airports to make this work. So it doesn't always work first try either, it seems, because I get different results in the same runway at the same airport as we saw there. That was at Heathrow 9 left, where we had one that didn't flare and got high, and then the other one that seemed to work out okay actually. So eventually we did get there. I'll have more videos to come, more tutorials, walkthroughs and explanations, both in X-Plane 11 and Microsoft Flight Simulator. I'm hoping to look at the Toliss A321, and we'll get an idea of how that handles a Autoland as well. That's it for today, so thank you very much for watching. I hope to see you again in another video soon, and I hope you have a very good day. Bye bye.